Good afternoon. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. It is my pleasure, also on behalf of my colleague Sushma Raman, to welcome our distinguished speaker and you, our audience, to this episode in our series on the fierce urgency of now. On a weekly basis, this series addresses challenges that one way or another are matters of economic justice. This is a freestanding series, and we think of it very much as the Carr Center's flagship series for the semester. But for some of you, it is also part of a class on economic justice that Sushma and I teach together. One focus of both our class and the series is the intersection of economic and racial justice. And one reflection of that is that the invited speakers are all people of color or scholars from the Global South. The title of today's seminar is What Remains: Liberalism and Racial Justice. Now, for some of you who follow American politics, and especially the presidential tweets, it might be a surprise that, as the title suggests, liberalism and racial justice would be at odds. After all, it might seem that the politics of the Democratic Party, liberalism, and a racial reckoning with America's past are all from the same cloth, and their intellectual outlooks are now all jointly targeted in the federal government's assault on the teaching of critical race theory, broadly conceived. But there are enormous complexities here, and both liberal thought and self-declared liberals have not always been welcomed as allies, while in particular many African-American intellectuals and activists. To remind you, among liberalism's key slogans, we have liberty, rule of law, limited government, democratic consent, and equal rights. But not only were these ideals not automatically bestowed upon everybody, those who defended them either explicitly excluded large segments of society, from women to people of color, or more commonly marginalized their presence and their concerns for a later day, or a year, or a decade, or indefinitely. The reality often was that if only white men pursue certain causes and don't allow others to join, they pursue them only for themselves and will find no incentive in extending the gains to anybody else. And if only white men build the agenda of political thought, as has been very much the case, this agenda will reflect the concerns of white men and generate a collective mindset among them that makes everybody else more or less invisible. And that now brings me to Charles Mills. Charles is a Jamaican-American political philosopher who currently serves as distinguished professor of philosophy at City University of New York. For decades now, Charles has done path-breaking work to persuade especially political philosophers that matters of race should not be confined to seminars in remote basement rooms at philosophical conferences, but that philosophy misses its target if it doesn't fully unveil the power structures of the day, both in society writ large, but also in the ways in which its own agenda comes about. Philosopher Chris LeBron called Charles our Black Socrates, roaming the philosophical streets, asking people why they think a society like ours, stained by a history of racial horrors, is not more ashamed of itself, and why its leading minds do not make that shame a motivating force in the struggle for a more just society, end quote. Much like American society, so philosophy as a discipline, so understood as a group of people doing work together, building agendas and enabling each other to have careers, has a long way to go to come to terms with these matters. But I can certainly say for myself that I'm immensely grateful to Charles for being the torchbearer of these efforts, and that engaging with his works has profoundly changed the way I see both politics and political thought. In the first part of our webinar today, I will ask him to explain some of his key notions, and then later my colleague Sushma Raman will ask some of her own questions, and then also integrate questions from people in the audience. So you guys should get ready for your own questions on this material. But now let me turn to Charles and open with a question to invite Charles to introduce some of the vocabulary with which he has been working also in the context of liberalism. Charles, in your work, you often talk about racial liberalism. In fact, your 2017 book, Black Rights, White Wrongs, has the subtitle, The Critique of Racial Liberalism. And that book then uses as its motto the phrase "towards a de-racialized liberalism." Could you unpack this a little bit for us? So what is racial liberalism? Is there a non-racial liberalism? And what does it mean to de-racialize liberalism?
Well, Mathias, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation and the Carr Center too, of course, and everybody organized involved in putting this together. I want to apologize to my audience, whom I can't see. Perhaps good we could save my embarrassment, my very non-distinguished haircut, which is basically, I think of as a kind of COVID haircut. So COVID gets the blame for everything. So why not my non-haircut as well? So 6 months without going to the barber, that's what explains that. Okay, so to the question now. Let's start talking about liberalism. And by liberalism, I mean the very broad sense. In the US political context, liberalism is sometimes used just to refer to the left, for example, the left of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, and so forth. But I'm using the term the way political theorists and political philosophers do. So that's a broad sense that includes both the political left and the political right. And as a liberal in that broad sense, you basically just committed to the individual as a sort of normative center of political theory, the individual's rights and freedoms, the individual's protections by the state and so forth. So it's important to sort of bear in mind, I'm not talking specifically about left liberalism, but in this very broad sense. Okay, so liberalism then has historically been the most important, the most successful political philosophy of modernity. That's over the past few hundred years. And unquestionably, as political scientists will tell you, it's the most important political ideology in American history. And as we just said, as Mathias just pointed out, the foundational presuppositions and commitments are supposed to be the freedom and the moral equality of individuals, regardless of their particular identity. So now it's not supposed to matter race, gender, creed, sexual orientation, none of that stuff. Basically, as a good liberal, you're supposed to be committed to making sure that everybody flourishes as an individual, that the legal system and the state protects your rights and so forth. So we can all see that these are very attractive ideals that everybody should be able to get on board without any problem. And you just think of the famous opening line of the Declaration of Independence from Thomas Jefferson: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So that's supposed to sort of encapsulate the basic commitments of the theory. But as we all know, that line was written by a slave owner. Jefferson owned slaves when he wrote that line. So it's sort of difficult to believe that his slaves he saw them as created equal with himself. And most of the signatories to the Declaration were likewise slave owners. So there seems to be a contradiction here. It's not just a contradiction for race, it's also a contradiction for gender, because as everybody watching this knows, we're now in the year that's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave white women basically the right to vote. So if you think of the distance in time between 1776 and 1920, that's almost 150 years. Why did it take so long? And we have to ask whether it was really men being created equal in the inclusive sense, or it was really males. And of course, it was really white men. Okay, so the question then is, how should we conceptualize this? I'm referring to another screen here, which is why you see me looking to one side. So what I suggest is there are two main alternatives as to how we sort of frame this unfortunate phenomenon of liberalism not living up to these ideas. Number one, we assume that liberal principles were really meant by their proponents to include everybody, but somehow they just did not live up to these principles. Number two, we assume that liberal principles were gendered and racialized from the start, so that white women and people of color were not seen as equal individuals in the first place. Okay, I mean, these exclusions are kind of accidental, they're mysterious, they're a kind of anomaly. On the second interpretation, they're not anomalous at all. Liberalism is so designed that the exclusions are symbiotically related to the principles. Symbiosis in the sense that it's liberalism for all men who really are men, not included women, and who really are white. So from that point of view, there's no contradiction at all. Rather, it means that the story we've been getting of liberal theory has basically been a misleading one, since from the very start, liberalism was gendered, liberalism was racialized. So sexism and racism then are not anomalies, they're not mysterious, they're structured into liberal principles, liberal theory, and liberal institutions and practices from the beginning. So a useful way to think of this, which sort of brings home the idea that it's sort of shaped by these exclusions rather than accidental, it's a liberalism that's patriarchal. Patriarchal liberalism shaped by male domination. And that's the kind of liberalism that, of course, feminist theorists and activists have been trying to overturn. And then from my particular angle, it's a liberalism that's racial, shaped by white domination. And the same way, the frameworks, assumptions, the rules and prescriptions of such liberalisms are going to be different from those of an inclusive liberalism, because it's a different set of rules for white men and white women. It's a different set of rules for white men and people of color. Okay, so the natural question then is, how should we respond to this? And again, I suggest there are two main alternatives. Number one alternative, which is one adopted by many radicals, is liberalism is hopeless. Given this sordid history of complicity with sexism and racism, liberalism is so corrupted in its origins that we should just abandon it. So that's the revolutionary alternative. Now, the reformist alternative, if you'll bear with me, is that we conclude that liberalism has indeed been so contaminated, but insist that nonetheless, liberalism can be retrieved. We can purge liberalism of its sexism and its racism, but it's going to require a major operation. We're going to need to rethink and reconstruct the apparatus of existing liberal theory, and then say, what would a liberalism purge of these exclusions look like? So one straightforward way of looking at feminist liberal theory is retrieval project for gender. And what I'm basically saying is, let's have a comparable retrieval project for race. So what would a deracialized liberalism look like? It would require us to reconceive liberalism not merely to get rid of stigmatizing references to people of color, which will be sort of rarer these days, though, as recent years been hidden before, but more fundamentally to correct for the legacy of these past exclusions in the way the theory is structured. So just as for feminists, gender justice needs to be put up front and central, I'm suggesting for a deracialized liberal theory, racial justice needs to be up front and central.
Thank you. Let me maybe come back to the terminology with which I asked the question. So if I understand this correctly, there is the liberalism as it's been developed by the traditional authors that would come to mind, including Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, and the present also John Rawls. That is racial liberalism. So it is not the case that there was a version of liberalism up to this point that is racial liberalism, and then there was also this non-racial. But basically, the charge is that liberalism as a whole has been something that just has been racialized in its nature. So no such thing as non-racial liberalism.
Sorry, I should maybe qualify a bit what I said. It's a well-known political theorist at the University of Chicago, Jennifer Pitts, and she has a very interesting book from about 10 years ago talking about the rise of a liberalism that she calls imperial. So we have patriarchal liberalism, racial liberalism, and imperial liberal theory. So Jennifer's suggestion is that in the early stages, if you go back to the 17th century, you do have a liberalism that is more not committed to imperialism and racism in the same way that it becomes so after about 1800. So I guess I should sort of back off a bit from what I said. I was thinking more of the US in particular. We think of liberalism in the global context and Western Europe. Jennifer Pitt's suggestion is that at the start, you get a liberalism that's not as consistently imperialist and racialized as, as it sort of later becomes, from the 1800s onwards.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So then let's maybe talk about one person who I think is among those whom you very strongly criticize for racializing liberalism in this way. And that's Immanuel Kant. And that Kant would get mentioned in this context will come as a surprise to a lot of people who are broadly familiar with philosophy. It comes to as a surprise to a lot of people within philosophy who never even knew that Kant had anything to say about race in the first place, let alone that he would be seen as a person who racialized liberalism. Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on how you see the role of Immanuel Kant in racializing liberalism?
Absolutely. So Kant is a wonderful example because, of course, he's been so sort of central to modern philosophy, central to the Enlightenment. And in effect, Kant has a twin paternity. He's seen as a father of modern moral theory insofar as his deontological, person-based theory, whose overarching imperatives that you have to respect the dignity of persons, has basically won the battle over its utilitarian competitor, where the idea there was that the imperative is to maximize social welfare. So Kant is now uncontroversially seen as the most important ethicist of modernity of the past few hundred years. So we can say he's the father of modern moral theory. But he has a sort of a paternity suit, shall we say, waiting from another direction, even though Kantians, Orthodox Kantians for a long time, wanted to contest this. He's also seen as the father of modern racial theory. So just think of the neatness of that. Father of modern moral theory, father of modern racial theory. And there's a debate among scholars of race as to how we should periodize race and racism. So some people basically uphold a short periodization. So their argument is that race and racism only arise in the modern period. So let's say 1500s, 1600s onwards. But that's been contested by two sets of scholars. There's what could be called the medium periodization against the short one. And these people say that race and racism arise in the West in the medieval period. That if you look, for example, at Christian iconography, you look at the representations of Jews and Muslims and what are called Ethiopians, clearly you're getting racialization there, though it's pre-modern. And there's a cohort of ancient scholars who would push it back even further and say that, in fact, you're getting racialization as far back as 5th century BCE Athens, and that the pioneering racist theories of the Western tradition is none other than Aristotle, insofar as the concept of natural slaves, which you find in the Politics, is for him ethnically marked. So Greeks can never be natural slaves. It's primarily non-Greek barbarians, above all Persians. So one of the key theorists, Benjamin Isaac, argues this is clearly a case of racism. So we need to sort of recognize that racism goes back all the way to the founding of the Western tradition. Okay, but here's the key thing. Even for those people who think that there is pre-modern racism, the sort of overarching background of assumptions of pre-modern racism is different from modern racism. It's primarily theological, in the sense that you're sort of assuming that it's through the intervention of God or through the intervention of demons or Satan that different races have the characteristics they do. It's theological, or it's cultural, or it's some weird kind of fusion of them. Oh, I've lost. Oh my God. So sorry. Yes, my computer's doing weird things. Doubtless it's been affected by COVID as well. Okay, so we can see and hear you. Okay, well, I couldn't see anybody at all. Okay, so modern racism is differentiated from pre-modern racism because it emerges as biological racism, what came to be called scientific racism, because it has pretensions being validated by science. And the key person in this emergence is none other than Immanuel Kant. And what Kant does, he demarcates a four-tiered sort of ranking of humanity. Europeans at the top, then Asians, then Africans, and Native Americans at the bottom. And Kant tells us that Africans and Native Americans are natural slaves, and he even gives advice in one passage of his work on how you should beat your African slaves. So you can understand why this sort of Kant, the dark side, why this was not an aspect of Kant that people wanted to highlight in the Kant establishment. But it's why it's so crucial to recognize this is because, as I say, this twin paternity, father of modern moral theory, father of modern racism, it exemplifies to perfection the division within the Enlightenment. That it's one set of rules for white people, another set of rules for people of color, and then Kant is appropriated by Rawls, by Jürgen Habermas, become the sort of central figure, not merely in moral theory, but in normative political philosophy. So it's so important. And all the time, there's this history, which means that we always need to ask, when we're reading Kant, does he mean the same set of prescriptions? Does he mean the same set of moral imperatives for white people as he does for people of color?
Thank you. So this is incredibly valuable and also speaks to some interesting work that's going on in the contemporary philosophical scene, that we're looking back and we are becoming, as a field, we are trying to become more aware of the often racist roots of a lot of thought that's informed the field. And one other person one could be thinking about here is Hegel, who comes a generation after Kant and is also very much stage setting in terms of how we perceive the history of philosophy also at a global scale. And basically is also somebody who said that philosophy is something that started with the Greeks and it's a European thing, and people in Asia, Africa, other parts of the world simply didn't have it.
They're prehistorical or they're ahistorical, and they can make no valuable philosophical contributions to anything.
Yeah. So, but let's move back to the present. So, in light of this diagnosis of liberalism, liberalism being having largely turned into racial liberalism, one couldn't blame Black thinkers for saying, okay, liberalism is just not a home for ourselves. But that's actually not and a fair number of them have drawn that conclusion, and they have gone elsewhere for articulating their political standpoint, but not you. So you actually work within liberalism, and the kind of liberalism that you hinted to this already as a kind of reformist understanding, you talk about Black radical liberalism. Black radical liberalism. Could you explain to us a little bit more what is Black radical liberalism? In particular, could you also speak about what the implications in terms of economic justice would be of Black radical liberalism?
Yes, sure. Well, part of the point of choosing the term is it has an attention-getting kind of oxymoronic character to it. So Black radicalism, we think, wow, that's clearly against liberal theory. There are these boring mainstream Black liberals, and then over here, with dark glasses and berets and maybe beards and guns, they're Black radicals. And I'm trying to bring them together and say, hey guys, we can get a liberalism that's a Black radical liberalism. So the best of both worlds, obviously. So the argument would be that in the process, in the sort of enterprise of deracializing liberal theory, we need to look at how liberalism has been racist in distinctive ways for different groups. Because unlike, even the case of feminist liberal theory, as we know, mainstream white middle class second wave feminist liberal theory was very much challenged by women of color, by third world women, and the point was, you're not really speaking for us. So in the case of race, it's even clearer, because of course the Black experience of racial subordination is different, for example, than the Native American experience of racial subordination. So in the latter case, for example, you're making land claims that you would not normally find in the Black tradition. So we need to demarcate different dimensions of the deracialization of liberal theory. So the way to think of Black radical liberal theory is as the particular deracialization that comes from focusing on the Africana experience, the Black experience, but it's basically provisional because for the long-term project of a deracialized liberal theory, you need to recognize that this racial subordination of other groups cannot just be conflated with Black racial subordination. And there's this phrase, the Black-white binary, and a warning: you can't basically try to force all racisms into the Black-white binary. Okay, so focusing specifically on Black radical liberal theory, then, the argument would be that you basically need to ask yourself, what are the sort of crucial recommendations that we'd expect for a deracialized liberal theory attentive to the history of Blacks? And I here mean not just Blacks in the United States, because of course there's a Black diaspora coming out of the experience of slavery, and certainly in some African countries like in South Africa, even the post-colonial period, you continue to have Black subordination. Okay, well, the two radical strains of the sort of Africana political tradition have historically been Black nationalism and Black Marxism. And as I say, they're sort of naturally counterposed to Black liberalism. And the idea is, there's no point in trying to do this liberal thing. It's hopeless, it's a dead end. We need to go this way or that way. So Black nationalism historically has tried to pursue some kind of project of a separatist kind. For example, in the 19th century, staying in the US is hopeless. These people will never accept us as equals. We need to return to Africa, or we need to find some welcoming destination in the Caribbean or Latin America. And then in the 20th century, obviously, you don't have many people advocating that anymore. But we need to try to work out a set of prescriptions for developing local Black control. For example, in big cities, Black communities, Black mayors and so forth, given that it's only when Blacks are in charge that we will be able to sort of feel secure that Black people's interests are being safeguarded. Black Marxism, on the other hand, as with the Marxist tradition in general, basically says the solution is socialism. You cannot achieve a non-racist society in a capitalist economy, and then you have a particular argument about the origins of racism, and the argument would be the origins of racism lie in the capitalist system. And people would point, for example, to that famous passage in Marx, Capital One, where he talks about in the rosy dawn of dawn of capitalism and primitive accumulation, talks about the genocide of indigenous peoples, African slavery, and this is then taken up in the 1940s by the person who would later become the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, famous book Capitalism and Slavery, arguing that the accumulation from the slave trade was crucial to enabling the takeoff within Europe of the capitalist system. And right there at Harvard, Mathias, as you know, a well-known theorist Sven Beckert and with colleagues, there's been a lot of work in this area, basically vindicating the Williams thesis that, as I say, stretches back to Marx, that slavery, African slavery, and colonial expropriation more generally, really crucial to the development of the capitalist system. So the Black Marxist tradition looks at all this stuff and says, you guys would be utterly naive to think you can ever get rid of racism under capitalism, because racism is brought into existence by capitalism, and racism is now functional for the ongoing reproduction of the actual system as such. So Black Marxism says, this Black nationalist project, immigration, separate Black communities, that's a dead end. What we need to try and do is forge a transracial class alliance, reaching out to the white working class, the white poor, the white unemployed, and God knows there are tens of millions of them, especially now, in the COVID crisis. And what you do, you try to advance a socialist project that would unite, the poor and the dispossessed and the exploited across racial lines. Okay, so Black radical liberalism is basically trying to draw on the key insights of both, because the Black nationalist critique of Marxism has traditionally been that you guys may recognize class domination, class exploitation. You don't recognize white supremacy. You don't recognize racial exploitation. you don't recognize the distinctive problems that Blacks have in a racist society. And this goes back in this country to the late 19th century, where you have Blacks getting involved in socialist parties, and you know, the leaders of these parties in some cases saying, there's a famous line, I can't remember the person, but a white leader, late 19th century, we don't have a particular program for the Negro. In other words, we have a general socialist program, you guys are welcome to join, but there's no particular agenda for the Negro as such. So Black radical liberalism draws from Black nationalism a recognition of the social ontology of race. So Marxism's social ontology tends to be class reductionist. Classes are the only things that really exist. Races don't really exist. Whereas Black nationalism, of course, makes an ontology of race central. So Black radical liberalism says races do exist, if not biologically, as social constructs. And then it draws from Black Marxism a recognition of this historic connection between capitalism and racism. And it's basically hopeful, especially given the failures of attempts to develop post, if you think of the sad history of the 20th century and what were being represented as post-capitalist states and all the oppressions of these states, Soviet Union, East Europe, and so forth. So Black radical liberalism is basically hopeful that perhaps you can get a social democratic, a left liberal capitalism, which will also have as part of the agenda targeted measures to correct for racial injustice. So the idea would be that the social democratic agenda as such, as we've seen, of course, for decades in Western Europe, that's not enough to tackle the problem of race because, there are distinctive, paths for, Black disadvantage that are not the same as the paths that you have for the white working class. So the idea would be a sort of social democratic project, but then within that, targeted measures to correct for the history and the ongoing realities of racial injustice. So that could mean, for example, reparations. If desegregation is unrealistic, given the sort of long history of hostility of whites to desegregation, then a sort of channeling of resources into Black and Latin communities to equalize things, a refurbishing of the educational system, given that that's so crucial to giving people the human capital that they need to compete on the market. And of course, if you go into inner city schools, you're at a serious disadvantage because of the lack of resources, because the teachers don't have the same kind of training. So there's a whole range of measures. The idea being you're going to correct for the legacy of racial injustice and ongoing structures of racial injustice that manifest themselves in all kinds of areas.
Thank you. So I have one more question for you at this stage, and then I will turn over to Sushma. Before I ask my question, let me also actually make a recommendation to the audience. So in this whole field of Black radical liberalism, Charles very much stands for that. So obviously, reading more Charles Mills always a good idea. If you want to read another author who is always who is working in this tradition, that is our very own, Harvard's very own Tommy Shelby, who published a book a few years ago called Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform. It's connecting there also to Charles Mills. And of course, as it goes with philosophers, there's some interesting internal disagreement between Charles and Tommy, but this is very much
minor disagreements, major agreements.
Major agreement on the overall line of Black radical liberalism, that liberalism actually can be made useful for the purposes of racial emancipation.
Exactly.
So Charles, my concluding, my last question at this stage before again handing over to Sushma is one term that you have done a lot of work on, and that has certainly helped me quite a bit coming to a better self-understanding of my own work and also my own role in society as a white male, is the term of white ignorance. Can you tell us what white ignorance is, and maybe also how our audience can work with that for their own purposes of self-reflection?
Yes, I have a 12-step program writer. Well, I don't actually, but sure, happy to talk about it. Okay, so within epistemology, as of course you know, in recent decades, we've seen the birth of what has come to be called social epistemology. And epistemology in the Western tradition in modernity for hundreds of years was shaped by Descartes' meditations, the Cartesian project, and famously that's an individualist project. You're there in your study, You're trying to find, propositions that you cannot doubt. You try to doubt everything, and you try to sort of reconstruct things from that basis, et cetera, et cetera. And what social epistemologists, as they develop the mainstream tradition, and of course, you could say there's a long tradition outside of mainstream analytic sources, continental tradition, Max Scheler, or Marx himself, and they're looking at social cognition from a sort of broader, non-individualist point of view. But anyway, in terms of analytic philosophy, which is where the action is in terms of the way profession conceives of itself, a few decades ago, you begin to get the realization in analytic circles that in fact, we're heavily dependent on other people's testimony for what we know. We cannot, in fact, sort of challenge every proposition. So we need to sort of face the fact of this, reliance on others. So we then need a broader set of norms and the individualist Cartesian norms that are going to address the question of what happens if, in certain respects, the testimony of the social group we're in, or the testimony of dominant social groups, both in terms of beliefs and in terms of intellectual frameworks, might be misleading. So under ideal social conditions, there'll be no structural generation of misleading testimony, because it's not the case that the society is built on exploitation. There's sort of ideal egalitarian relations between everybody, and you don't have to worry about a sort of overarching source of misleading beliefs, misleading conceptual frameworks. But in a non-ideal society, in an oppressive society, it's radically different, because it then means that some groups are unfairly privileged over others, and these groups are unfairly privileged, do not normally want to sort of face the fact that they're the beneficiaries of an oppressive system. So they will generate ideologies, rationalizations that basically justify their domination. And in addition, they will not want those who are subordinated to say, hey, this is unjust, we need to do something about it. So there'll be an attempt to socialize the subordinated into these beliefs also. So the way to think of white ignorance is as, basically the falling within that framework. It's a particular kind of non-knowing. So that's why I have the emphasis on ignorance. Non-knowing, that's going to be very prevalent in a white racist society, though of course you can imagine other kinds of ignorance in racist societies that are dominated by other racial groups. And for some people, ignorance has an association with innocence. So you say that, well, really, you're letting white people off the hook because you're saying it's an innocent ignorance. I'm using the phrase white ignorance in the broad sense that includes culpable ignorance as well. That includes, in other words, ignorance of things that you're in a position to know, and for various reasons, for example, the denial, self-deception, averting your eyes, etc., you refuse to know. So white ignorance is meant to encompass a wide range of phenomena, structural as well as individual. So think, for example, of the education most children would have gotten in the United States up, let's say, to the 1950s, 1960s. And it's quite shocking if you go back to textbooks from that era. They basically have a picture of society being painted in which slavery is a benevolent institution, in which Native Americans either don't appear at all, or they're savages, and whatever was their due has been given to them because they got the reservations. So sort of no adequate representation of the systemic subordination of people of color. So you then get a white ignorance that is unsurprising because it's what is being taught in the schools, in your middle school, in high school, and so forth, and it's massively reinforced by the media. Most people in this audience, I would guess, are probably too young, but even in Jamaica, I grew up on American Westerns, and the Western and those, we're not talking about the sort of new revisionist Western of, let's say, the 1970s onward, where the US cavalry are the bad guys. Western in those days, you have these heroic white people, they're settling the West. The West is full of savages. For some mysterious reason, these savages keep attacking us. So, you kill the savages and so forth and so forth. So you're getting massive socialization from television, from movies, from novels. And just think of it. The most successful movie in American history, it might even be world history for all I know, once you adjust for inflation, is gone with the wind. Basically a romanticization of the good old days on the slave plantation, where you're sitting on the veranda, you're sipping your mint julep, the darkies are singing happily in the cotton fields. I mean, a complete whitewash of the atrocities of slavery. This is the most popular move in US history. So you're getting this combined socialization from the educational system, from the mass media. It's no wonder that white ignorance is basically rampant. And a few years ago, there's this really revealing survey, I think, by the Pew Research Foundation, and they asked, white Americans, which race do you think is most likely to be subject to discrimination in the United States of today? And the majority of the respondents said white people. So the really oppressed race in the United States are white people. Now, I would like to think that after a summer of ongoing Floyd demonstrations, motivated by the killing of George Floyd, I would like to think that those figures have changed. But that was the statistical reality a few years ago. A majority of white Americans felt that the race were most likely to be subject to discrimination in the United States are white Americans. So you could not want a more clear-cut example of white ignorance.
Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you, Mathias, for getting this conversation started. I have so many questions. I think we could spend several hours talking, but I'm wondering, what is your take on the connection between what you've outlined and the Black radical liberalism and work on intersectionality and critical race theory?
Yes, and obviously it's a crucial issue, because historically the danger has been that you have demands for racial justice, quote unquote, that are not sensitive to gender issues. And there's been a history of women of color, Black and brown, and of course, we must not forget Native peoples either, saying that you guys are putting forward male-centered conceptions of racial justice. We need to recognize the complexities that are brought in once you have injustices that are not merely racialized but gender. So an adequate treatment would have to take account of intersectionality. So what I'm giving you is a sort of fairly abstract and one-sided treatment, but in partial self-defense, let me say quickly, I did co-author a book with well-known feminist theorist Carol Pateman, author of The Sexual Contract, immediate inspiration for my book, The Racial Contract. And in this book, Carol and I did various things. We gave some answers to our critics, but in addition, we each had chapters in which we tried to address the issue of intersectionality. So if you're working within a contract framework, as I was trying to do, how do you frame these issues as a contract? And what I argued in my chapter is that you can't speak of the racial contract and the sexual contract in isolation, because races are gendered and the sexes are raced. So what you really need is a kind of composite concept, and I coined the somewhat awkward phrase, the racial-sexual contract. And I then said, what does a racial-sexual contract look like? Well, it looks like this. And then what would justice require? You would then sort of need to take into account how people are differentially disadvantaged by race and gender because of this composite contract. So that was my attempt in my book with Carol Pateman.
So you've talked about the various dimensions of racial injustice, as well as sort of suggested principles for corrective racial justice. And I'm wondering if you could share some of the broad themes for our audience today.
Yes, sure. Okay. So in keeping with the project of trying to retrieve liberalism for racial justice and working specifically within contract theory, there's no necessity about this, because liberal theory has different strains and there are different ways of approaching racial justice within liberal theory. But insofar as my best known book is my first one, The Racial Contract, it seemed to make sense that I'm going to sort of engage with contract theory. And obviously the key person I need to engage with is John Rawls, because he's the one who brings back social contract theory, because it had basically been dead since the early 1800s or so. and he brings it back to life, and he reorients it. So originally, the contract was basically seeking to address the question of what is our political obligation to the state. So the sort of classic Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, those guys, 1650 to 1800, that century and a half, that's their main focus. How do you adjust our obligation to the state? And Rawls shifts the focus of contract theory of the normative aspect of contract theory from political obligation to the justice of a society's basic structure. But here's the problem. His focus is on ideal theory. And ideal theory does not just mean normative theory, because obviously you need normative, you're going to talk about justice. Those go together. He means the normative theory of a perfectly just society. So you're looking at what's the normative theory of the basic structure of a perfectly just society. And that was the focus of his work. And he never shifted to the different question of what measures of corrective justice would you need for a society that's not perfectly just. So he mentions the phrase compensatory justice, so far as I can tell, from when I went over his work years ago, a grand total of twice in the 2,000 pages of his 5 books. Compensatory justice, in my opinion, he's meaning corrective justice, and he basically says, just very briefly, that there's, in some fashion, you derive these principles of corrective justice from the ideal ones, but he never goes into detail. So my criticism of Rawls and the Rawls industry, because of course, he has many disciples and followers, is basically, why have you guys not followed up on this, given that Rawls himself said explicitly in the opening pages of A Theory of Justice, the issues of non-ideal theory are the pressing ones. So he says explicitly, look, I'm going to work on an ideal theory, but issues of non-ideal theory are the pressing ones. However, I think to do non-ideal theory properly, you need as an adequate theoretical foundation to start with ideal theory. But nonetheless, the idea is you start with this and you then move on to that. So my challenge to mainstream Rawlsians has been, and I've been sort of saying this for a long time now, why have you guys not made the move to non-ideal theory as corrective justice, and specifically, why have you not said, basically next to not, why have you said, hardly anything about race and correcting racial injustice all these years? Okay, so the particular approach I decided to take myself is to argue that, and this is something that is a kind of, a light dawned. I'm waiting to see whether it's a real light or a bogus light, but I seem to have an epiphany, an apparent epiphany. I leave it phrased in that way because it may turn out not to be a real epiphany. But my apparent epiphany was that Rawls basically was talking about societies that were either ideal or close enough to ideal that you could conceptualize them as cooperative ventures of mutual advantage with reciprocally beneficial rules. In the opening pages of A Theory of Justice, he says this, but he says it in a confusing way, which makes one think he's defining a society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. And obviously that's crazy and inconsistent with what he says in later work, because most societies, maybe all societies, are oppressive in one way or another. In his later work, he talks about law states and so forth. So he could not be defined by that. So my epiphany was to sort of realize, or apparently realize, as I say, I'm leaving it open for people to challenge me and show that I'm wrong. My apparent epiphany is that Rawls is basically telling us my theory of justice is limited to societies that meet this criteria. They're cooperative ventures for mutual advantage with reciprocally beneficial rules. They're either perfect examples, well-ordered societies, or since there's sort of no such cases in the history of the human race, they're somewhat deviant, but only slightly so. So the cooperative venture characterization, you think of that as genus, and then under that genus, you have well-ordered societies, the perfect kind, and then imperfect societies that are not ideal, but nonetheless, they're close enough to ideal that you can say they're still cooperative ventures. And the implication of that, if my reading is correct, is that John Rawls' theory of justice only applies to societies that meet the cooperative venture characterization. And this implication, if I'm right, is very shocking, because it then means that any society that's deeply oppressive falls outside the ambit of Rawls's theory, for the simple reason that you cannot claim that an oppressive society is a cooperative venture of mutual advantage. It's just crazy. And in Justice as Fairness, his last book, Rawls has two linked passages on pages 14 and 21, and he says there that my theory of justice is for modern liberal democratic societies, and it excludes racist societies, slave societies, confessional states, caste societies. Have I got them? It's 5. So caste, confessional, and so what's the other?
I said, who is left?
Well, good question. But the crucial implication, as I said, the sort of light dawned, and I thought to myself, this book has been out, I'm talking about Justice as Fairness, since 2001 or so. I've read it more than once. How come I've never seen this before? Rawls is telling us his theory of justice does not apply to racist societies, because you cannot conceptualize a racist society as a cooperative venture mutual advantage. It's as obvious and simple as that. So this made me recognize that, in a sense, Rawls' entire project, I don't want to say it's a waste of time, because you can extrapolate in certain ways, but you cannot use Rawls as is to do racial justice. My claim would be because racist societies are not cooperative ventures. So my solution then is to retain the apparatus of choice behind a veil of ignorance, but I shift the circumstances of your choice, and I ask people to put themselves in the following situation. So there's a Rawlsian thought experiment, the famous one, and there's a far less famous Millsian thought experiment, which I'm hoping will catch on, especially in this time of vastly increased concern about racial justice. You put yourself behind the veil, but it's now not a veil to carry forward the normative mission of ideal theory, but of non-ideal theory. So your circumstances are non-ideal ones. And what you know behind the veil is that when the veil lifts, you're going to be in a society of racial domination, or to make it specifically to the US, a society of white racial domination. And the key fact that you do not know about yourself, and this is what gets the thought experiment going, the combination of self-interest as a motivation, plus a sort of careful ignorance, to make the combination of the two the equivalent of a moral choice. You ask yourself, when the veil lifts, suppose I turn out to be a person of color. So you don't know your race. So the idea is that this enforces the people behind the veil to ask themselves, what would I need in the way of corrective public policy for my situation in the society that I'm entering to be as non-disadvantaged as possible? If I'm white in a white supremacist society, okay, that's great, business as usual. But if suddenly I turn out to be non-white in a white supremacist society, that's a radically different story. So issues of racial justice, which are virtually completely absent from the mainstream Rawls body of work, Rawls and post-Rawlsian, are now suddenly center stage. And my claim would be that you'd come up with 3 principles of corrective racial justice. Principle number 1, end second-class civic status. So the idea is that historically, people of color in societies of white domination have either been non-citizens or second-class citizens. So you end second-class civic status. Principle number 2, end racial exploitation. And principle number 3, end institutionalized racial disrespect. Okay, so by racial exploitation, I'm basically arguing that societies of racial domination are founded, among other things, on the differential treatment of people of color, which redounds to the benefit of whites. So the 2 classic examples, obviously in US history, Native American expropriation, or if not outright expropriation, getting the land under some fraudulent circumstances. But anyway, you basically get the access to most of the continent, and clearly this benefits whites. And African slavery, where you're not paying people for their labor, to getting the benefit of unpaid labor. But my claim would be that subsequent to that, you continue to have all kinds of practices of discrimination, for example, Jim Crow discrimination. For example, if you think of the federal government and its role in guaranteeing mortgages to white homeowners and depriving blacks of an equal chance to accumulate wealth. If you think of things like in the trade union movement, not protesting discrimination against blacks, keeping blacks out of trade unions. So there's a whole set of mechanisms, and you look to the social science literature, to sociology and political science and economics, and you sort of bring all this stuff into philosophy and say that cumulatively these measures advantage whites at the expense of people of color. And ever since this book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, Melvin Oliver, Thomas Shapiro, originally in 1995, second edition about 2005, there's been all this material outside of philosophy on the huge wealth divide and the circumstance that bring it into existence. So my second principle, ending racial exploitation, would be that we need to look at all these mechanisms and institute safeguards and correctives that are going to make sure that that does not continue to happen, and that the unjust proceeds, what's called in the liberal tradition unjust enrichment, it's normally used in a much narrower way, so we expand the concept and say that whites as a group have benefited from unjust enrichment. And then finally, institutional racial disrespect. What I'm talking about there is the fact that in a society that's an oppressive one, as against the social contract model of everybody cooperating, people of color are denied equal moral status. And this would manifest itself in various ways: disrespect for their culture, disrespect for their cognitive capacities, disrespect for their bodies, disrespect for their personhood. So I gather these four under the category of ontological disrespect and say that we need to correct for this also. So you can think, for example, of the protests about the Civil War monuments and statuary and army bases being named after leading Confederate generals and so forth. These are all manifestations of institutional disrespect, so that the protest against them sort of fits neatly under this third category. So my belief is that these three basic principles would cover the sort of crucial demands people have been making for racial justice.
So two demands that we've heard from social movements in the US, but also in other countries, is around defunding of the police, specifically sort of dismantling the systems that surveil Black people. And secondly, around reparations, which really has been not just in the US, but globally. How do these principles intersect with those demands? Do they support them? How does that work?
The first principle, end second-class civic status, I would say it covers the first. The whole area of policing, we need to sort of look at why brown, Black, and red bodies are differential within the prison system. And it has to do with the fact of not being seen as an equal member of the polity, as somebody with equal rights. So you then need to sort of go through the literature on criminology and social science, and again say, what are the different places at which discrimination enters? Because there's the original thing of profiling, there's who's arrested, there's who gets a lawyer, a decent lawyer you can pay for, who gets a public defender, who gives 15 minutes to your case and says, look, you better plea bargain this because you'll get 5 years in jail. And then there's discrimination in terms of the jury, and it's sort of long history of dismissing jurors of color, and that's still going on now. And then there's prejudice in terms of how the defendant is perceived, and again the sort of well-known statistics that the people when people of color kill whites, it's treated far differently than when people of color kill each other, or than when whites kill people of color. So as I say, you need to look at the social science material. And part of the point of my recommendation is that ideal theory has proven largely a dead end because of its disengagement from reality. And if you're serious about social justice, you need to look at the mechanisms of injustice, which means that social justice theory needs to be informed by social science.
This has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor Mills, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for joining us as well. We'd like to continue the conversation with you, so please stay in touch and join us next week for a conversation with on neoliberalism and Black politics with Michael Dawson, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. Thank you all.
Thank you.